So after having spoken last week about some of the worst parody movies of all time, I figured this week it'd be fun to actually talk about a good parody movie, and just what it takes to write good satire. Now, there are a lot of satirical comedies out there that I do enjoy, and I plan on talking about more in future. But today, I figured I'd discuss one of the funniest, best written parody movies of the modern era in my opinion, that being Hot Fuzz. Hot Fuzz is part of a trilogy of movies known as the Cornetto Trilogy. Each one stars Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, each one parodies a particular genre of movie, and each one features a different flavour of cornetto, among other things. Hot Fuzz specifically satirises police action movies. Unlike last week's terrible parody movie Vampires Suck, rather than focusing on one movie, it focuses on the entire genre, and rather than just shallow mockery, well, it certainly pokes fun, but at the same time, you can absolutely tell that the people behind it had a deep love for these movies and their ridiculous tropes and cliches. Hot Fuzz is the story of Sergeant Nicholas Angel, your typical police action movie protagonist. He's competent, badass, and extremely dedicated to his job. So much so that the rest of the Metropolitan Police are sick of him showing them up and decide to relocate him to the tiny rural village of Sandford. Now, as I said in my previous review, one of the funniest ways to parody a movie or genre is taking the typical protagonist and sticking them in a completely different and inappropriate situation. Either one that's a lot more absurd, or a lot more realistic, or some combination of the two. Nicholas Angel goes from stopping deep inner city crime to dealing with much less serious offences like underage drinking, petty shoplifting, and a swan escaping. All the while, he is generally staying in the mindset of a serious action movie protagonist, only to be constantly shown that he's probably taking things a bit too seriously. On top of that, his character does undergo a lot of deconstruction in the process. We see the major downside of such a hero, that being that someone so dedicated to the job is gonna have a pretty lousy social life. And not helping is the fact that his strict and humorless demeanour make it hard for co-workers to like him. Despite being so successful in his career, it's made him pretty lonely and unpopular. The only new co-worker of his that seems to get along with him is his new partner Danny, who is effectively the stand-in for your typical fan of the police action genre. Danny is pretty much in awe of Nicholas Angel, given he seems no different to the action heroes of the cop movies that he loves so much. However, he also seems to be making a lot of assumptions about what big city police life is truly like based on said movies, much to the annoyance of Sergeant Angel.
Have you ever fired your gun up in the air and gone, ah? No, I have not ever fired my gun up in the air and gone, ah.
Thing is, despite poking fun at these tropes and the fans who take them seriously, at the same time, the film does embrace them. In spite of injecting a lot of realism during the first half, such as acknowledging the ungodly amount of paperwork involved in policing and just how tedious investigations can truly be, the second half of this movie does remind us that as silly as films like this are, they can still be a hell of a lot of fun. Sergeant Angel starts to notice a string of mysterious deaths occurring across the village. Piecing them all together, he comes up with a very viable theory as to who is causing them and why. The culprit, however, has a solid alibi. While Angel seems defeated, just as he's figuring out a new theory, he's attacked by an assailant and narrowly escapes. Tracking down the true culprits, he learns the real truth of the situation. It's at this point that the realism built up in the first part of this movie is completely turned around and replaced with hilarious absurdity. It turns out that the real motive behind the murders is that the village of Sandford is completely obsessed with the idea of winning the Village of the Year award, having lost their first ever attempt due to the arrival of a group of travellers, which led Police Chief Butterman's wife Irene to kill herself after having dedicated all her time to the award. Ever since then, the Neighbourhood Watch has dedicated themselves to ridding their village of anyone who could stand in their way of winning and being seen as perfect. While Angel assumes that the murders were all down to a far more serious conspiracy, he learns the real reasons behind their deaths were things as petty as making spelling mistakes in a newspaper and being a bad actor.
You murdered him for that? Well, you murdered Bill Shakespeare.
What?
Oh, then...
Nicholas narrowly escapes, but Danny convinces him to return to London for his own safety. While stopping for petrol, however, Nicholas spies some cop movie DVDs, much like the ones he used to watch with Danny. Throughout the second act, Nicholas had managed to properly befriend Danny through watching these movies with him, learning to appreciate them, and learning to actually relax and enjoy them as a silly escape from his super serious life. And after the film spent so much time deconstructing the police action genre, in this moment it spins it right round and begins to reconstruct it, by having Angel flat out embrace the role of over-the-top action movie protagonist, gearing up and taking on the neighbourhood watch. Despite the embrace of ridiculous action movie tropes, the comedy absolutely remains strong by the ridiculousness of the enemies not being thugs or gang members, but instead being elderly members of a small town neighbourhood watch, all wielding knives and guns while fighting for the right to murder anyone who slightly damages their village's pristine reputation. Hot Fuzz is a strong example of a film that can mock and parody its source material while still understanding and caring a great deal about it. As I say, while Danny does feel like a stand-in for fans of the police action genre, he still remains a very likeable character who respects Sergeant Angel to the point of wanting to improve his game in order to be just like him. And it is possible to point out how silly a lot of these cliches are, while still admitting how fun they can be to watch. While other members of the Cornetto trilogy, Shaun of the Dead and World's End, are also comedic takes on film genres, both of them do have their dark and serious moments. I think what separates Hot Fuzz is that when things get dark and serious, they actually get a lot more hilariously ridiculous. The idea of a police chief murdering multiple members of his community and using his power to cover it up is horrifying. The idea that he's doing it purely to win a meager Village of the Year award and is killing people for crimes as minor as having an overly large house or an annoying laugh, on the other hand, is so over-the-top ridiculous that you can't help but giggle. When it comes to parody, whether you love or hate the source of your mockery, you need to actually understand how it works and what to make fun of. If you are simply ripping on something popular for the sake of it, only targeting the low-hanging fruit because you don't know enough about it to make any smarter jokes, then what you end up with is often shallow, uninspired, and will get a minor laugh at best and nothing more. To create a good parody, first, you do need a basic concept that any audience can find funny. The majority of your audience will be familiar enough with what makes a typical action movie protagonist, and will likely laugh at seeing such a character being forced to waste their talents simply chasing after a runaway swan. On top of truly being familiar with what you're parodying, your jokes should have a purpose beyond just, haha, this thing that the source material does is kind of goofy. For example, Hot Fuzz mocks the cliche of having an obvious suspect who turns out to be innocent of the crime with Simon Skinner, but rather than just saying, haha, this blatantly evil dude was actually perfectly good and innocent, it's revealed that Skinner is just as blatantly evil as he first led on, but the real reason he murdered his own cousin was not selfish financial greed, but rather just to stop her from sharing her gardening tips with a different village. Not only does Skinner's overly obvious villainy make sense, given he was clearly trying to send Angel down the wrong path entirely, but the real joke behind the truth of his villainy is still hilarious. Ultimately, the worst thing a bad parody can do is simply not care. Parodies that don't care will often feel like they're mocking another work as a crutch for the fact that they can't come up with better original material. But good parodies, whether lovingly or not, should embrace the work that they're mocking. You need to dig further into the surface level material for jokes if you truly want to appeal to the audiences and not merely come across as a shallow cash grab just trying to ride off of a better known product. Otherwise, chances are, in the long run, people are only really going to remember the original and the mockery is just going to fade from relevancy. Hot Fuzz, on the other hand, is a movie I will always remember. It's not just an excellent parody, but it's a hilarious movie regardless. The jokes in this movie are funny even if you aren't familiar with the genre, and if you are familiar, then even if you're a fan, the film still feels like it's laughing with you rather than at you. Because at the end of the day, nothing is perfect, and it's always acceptable to poke a little fun at the silly things you love while still loving them. Thanks for watching the video. As I mentioned earlier, this probably won't be the last time I talk about parody movies, as I do have other works I'd like to tackle in future. In particular, I plan on maybe making a video about Cabin in the Woods at some point, so definitely stay tuned if you're interested in that. In the meantime, as always, like, share and subscribe and donate to me on Patreon if you can, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye.